So last night we had the first class of our 7-week series in Newport on cultivating compassion in everyday life. And so we went through the first chapter of living with an open heart, or what's the American title? Open-hearted life, thank you. And that really focuses on motivation, setting our motivation, and that even if you do the same action, your motivation matters. It makes a big difference. And we focused on everyday activities like cooking a meal for your family or doing the dishes. And many of us here know that a big part of our practice is setting our motivation before we do things like offer service or cook. And it was an interesting contrast in that I came back to the Abbey and was reading a few articles about some of the things going on in the world. And I read this piece that's a bit controversial, but I kind of wanted to see what it said directly rather than seeing what other people were saying about it. And the reason that these two came together is this question of what is our motivation when we engage in peaceful protest, when we engage in nonviolent action to try to raise awareness or maybe sway people's opinion regarding something going on in the world. And so this piece was written by someone involved with a particular political movement who's been involved in protests. And effectively, one of the things it was saying is that pacifism, their approach to peaceful protest and nonviolent action, has not worked. That a year in, nothing has changed. Protesters are being assaulted, arrested, and being punished in these terrible ways. And the author basically raised the question of, why do the people in power have the monopoly on violence? And I was just so taken aback in that effectively it's like, oh, your only reason for peaceful protesting was that you thought it would get you what you wanted. You didn't actually have a commitment to that idea of peace and nonviolence. And I think this relates to the mental factor that we typically call integrity here, in Tibetan ngotsa shepa, or in Sanskrit I think kri. And I like Alex Berzin's translation of this one, that he uses the term having a sense of values. So self-respect, integrity, they all go together. So that idea that for many of us, if we're engaging in peaceful protest, nonviolent action, some sort of political demonstration, that for me at least, being peaceful, not harming anyone, making sure there's no anger in my mind, ideally, is really that question of that's about my value. It doesn't matter if it works or not on some specific time scale or delivers some specific outcome. It's about my integrity, saying that it is a deep value of mine to not harm, and that's perhaps even more important than that kind of political goal that I'm protesting, that I'm trying to work towards. Even if my political goal, I think, is going to reduce the harm that's impacting others, I shouldn't resort to harm to get that goal. At least that's my value, and I think a value we all here share. And it also brought to mind a more a lower level version of this, is this idea of political correctness, that for me, avoiding discriminatory speech or racist jokes, things like that, using inclusive language, has always been about, well, I think this is important. Inclusivity is a value of mine. And then I met people who just were quite happy to say what they thought and said, well, I don't believe in political correctness. And now in the country, it seems like political correctness is somewhat out the window. And it's like, oh, these were people who just were not saying the things they believed because they thought they weren't supposed to. They thought, okay, people will judge me. It isn't that it actually, what they were saying reflected their values. So this idea that sometimes we might have these cultural status quos about, okay, we engage in peaceful protest or we don't say racist jokes. And that for some of us, it really reflects our values. But for others, they're just going with it. And then at a certain point, those shackles come off and they're thrilled. So, in stark contrast to this, I think about, of course, the civil rights movement and the great history we have in this country. Certainly, there are examples in other parts of the world, such as South Africa and Gandhi and India in particular. But our civil rights movement very much was about peaceful, nonviolent action. And my hero from this is John Lewis. So John Lewis passed away a few years ago, but up until that point, he was an incredible advocate for equality and for nonviolence. And at one point on the 50th anniversary of I believe the March for Washington and maybe even the Selma March, he pointed out he was the only one who was a leader in that group who was still alive. So he's given many talks, and I wanted to share some quotes from a talk he gave in 2013, because I think this is a beautiful example of integrity, having these deep sense of values, in this case about nonviolence, and that value being more important in a way than anything else. When he was interviewed, especially about 8 years ago, being asked, well, how do you feel now that Black Lives Matter protests are happening? Are you sad that we haven't gotten there yet? And he's like, well, of course we still have a lot to do, but he has no regrets. So this is from John Lewis in 2013. We start sitting in, Black and white college students, Black and white high school students, sitting there in orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion, waiting to be served. So this is the sit-ins at diners, these white-only establishments in the South. And someone would come up and spit on us, put a lighted cigarette out in our hair or down our backs, pour hot water, hot coffee, or hot chocolate on us, pull us off the lunch counter stools. We were orderly, peaceful. Many of us accepted nonviolence as a way of life, as a way of living. But we were charged with disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace. We got arrested. I went to jail the first time on February 27th, 1960. He was 20 years old. Between 1960 and 1966, I was arrested and jailed 40 times for sitting in or going on a freedom ride, marching for the right to vote. Beaten at a Greyhound bus station in South Carolina, beaten at the Greyhound bus station in Montgomery, Alabama, and left bloody and unconscious. Beaten, having a concussion, on that bridge in Selma, Alabama, on March 7, 1965, a day that became known as Bloody Sunday. But I never became bitter or hostile, never gave up. I never gave in, I kept the faith. And during all these many years, I've tried to keep my eyes on the prize. So he didn't, after a year or two, say, well, this isn't working. Let's just fight back with our own dogs and hoses. He and all of the other incredible civil rights leaders at that time, many before them and many since, have been committed to nonviolence. But he got arrested. He got beaten. He got jailed. And this is where it comes back to motivation. The external validation, or lack thereof, we get from the world is not how we can judge our actions. We cannot always know, am I doing the right thing or not, based on the external response I get. Because I think John Lewis was doing the right thing. He didn't have hate in his mind. He was standing up for what he believed was right, and he was beaten and put in jail. So that isn't to say, by any means, that we should go out and do things to get ourselves arrested, but that in our own lives, our day-to-day existence, how much are we looking for that approval, for people to praise us, to have that good reputation, rather than actually living with integrity and our own values? And he called this good trouble. That when he was a child and saw the racism that existed, the fact that there were certain places he couldn't go, that he had to go and sit up in the balcony at the movie theater while the white little boys could go sit down in the front. He was upset about this, and his parents said, just stay quiet, this is how it is, don't get in trouble. Well, John Lewis got in good trouble. So after he was involved in civil rights and some different political groups, he then was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1986, representing Atlanta. I got to vote for him twice. He served 17 terms, in almost all of them, I think, except one or two, winning 70% or more of the vote. After being elected to Congress, he was arrested 5 more times. He led many actions, even in Congress. There was a sit-in that they had in the House of Representatives to try to do something about gun violence. And some of the House Democrats, after even the congressional session was concluded, sat there in protest for 26 hours. And I believe he did that in his late 70s. He advocated for the Smithsonian Museum dedicated to the history of African Americans in this country, and many other things that I can't all go into, but I'm sure some people are familiar. And if you're not familiar with this incredible person, I invite you to look it up online. He just had an incredible life. And so sometimes when we think about our actions, when we especially think about actions in the way of protesting, and this was a criticism often raised of Black Lives Matter protests, of would Martin Luther King have done this? Would Martin Luther King approve of what you're doing? And I find this, again, coming back to this mental factor of consideration for others. And I think it's tricky. Sometimes we lose a little bit track of what this means when we use that term. Berzin's translation of this is having scruples. This is the Tibetan Chalyapa, or the Sanskrit apatrapya, not my native language. And this is really avoiding actions based on the impact it will have on others. Not like, oh, I don't want to hurt someone. It's like, okay, that's lots of other mental factors like compassion. But just that idea of if I act in a certain way, people will lose faith in me. People will lose faith in what I represent. My teacher might be ashamed of me. And so that idea that if someone is protesting, and especially if you're protesting for something like Black Lives, that thought that, wow, what would the civil rights leaders think if they saw my actions? And it was amazing that at that time we had John Lewis joining in some of the Black Lives Matter protests and making that clear statement that yes, you can do this without violence, you can do this without property damage, and we can still do this even if we're being beaten, arrested, and pepper sprayed. So as we engage in whether it's our small daily actions or bigger political actions, let's keep these two mental factors in mind, holding dear to our own values, regardless of what external things come at us as a result. And remember that when we have these people we respect, who we care about because they are wise and we want to be like them, we should question whether they would be proud and approve of our actions or not. So with it in mind that we should care about what the people who we respect, the wise ones, say. One more quote from John Lewis. I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe.